thank you very, very much, everyone, for joining what is the last in this year's Sunset series. And welcome to Morecambe Partnership. I'm Tom, and I'm the chair of the partnership, so I'm a volunteer. And as well as chairing the charity, I'm also sort of brought in to chair these Sunset series talks. I'll just say a little bit about our speaker tonight. I'm not going to say very much because I think he doesn't need that much of an introduction. But Professor Mike Berners-Lee is one of the leading sort of figures, really, I think, in sort of popularizing sort of concern about a changing climate and also action in a changing climate as well. Professor at University of Lancaster at the Environment Centre there. And as well as being an academic, he also runs a business called Small World Consulting. And that's really helping businesses and organizations of any size help to sort of engage with the climate and ecological emergency. And yes, there's a little bit of sort of, I was going to say fear. I know fear is not a very healthy emotion, but just kind of making this feel really real, but also telling us what we can actually do about it. And ultimately, in a really, really sort of inspiring, can-do, positive way, which I think is obviously what so many of you are here for today. And if any of you have heard him speak before, if you've heard, if you've read his books like There's No Planet B, which is I've heard Mike talk about that before, or How Bad Are Bananas, then you'll know just, kind of how invigorated and energized I think you'll feel at the end of tonight. But Mike, everyone's here to listen to you, not to me. So I shall hand over to you, and thank you very, very much for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for joining the call. So I'm going to talk tonight. Actually, some of the stuff I'll start off talking about does come from There's No Planet B, which is kind of a for me it's background, essential sort of context, and then some of it, some of the stuff I'll talk about is from more relates to the next book that I'm just starting to write about, actually, and I'll try and sort of thread in links to what this means for Morecambe Bay as we go. So just to begin with, I wrote No Planet B because I'd been working on climate change for quite a long time, and it was clear that if you really wanted to deal with climate change, you had to see it as one symptom of something bigger that was going on for humans right now, something much bigger. And so I'm going to start by talking about that, the really big context that we're in. And the easiest way I know of getting into that is to have a look, if I can just get my, yes, is to have a look at this graph of global energy use dating back 150 years. There it is, going up and up and up. Humans are using more energy all the time. Over the last 50 years, it's gone up by 2.4% per year on average, which is like a double up every 30 years or a factor of 10 every century. And we use all this energy for lots of wonderful things, and we combine it with a rising technological sophistication, and it's allowing us to be having a meeting now online without being face to face, and we're all comfortable in our homes because of our energy supplies that we've got, and it's brought us many wonderful things in life. But it's also true to say that through our rising use of energy and the rising technology that goes with it, we have become an increasingly influential species on this planet of ours. And that didn't matter for a very long time, for millennia. It didn't matter that we were becoming more powerful because the planet as a whole was still so powerful compared to everything we could do to it that it could broadly speaking put itself back together again, whatever we did to it. So we could treat it like a big robust playground of a place. But gradually that balance of power started to change, and suddenly it really changed. And we entered this era that some people have a big word for, and I just use it really simply. We've entered this era called the Anthropocene, which just means the era in which it's humans that are the biggest thing affecting the ecosystem. And my little cartoony diagram for it is that it's a change in context from being small people, a small species running around on a big planet, to a huge species running around on a small, delicate, fragile planet. And what I want to emphasize about this is two things. The first is that it's very recent that this has happened. We can argue about exactly when, but 100 years ago, we couldn't smash the whole place up, even if we tried. 50 years ago, we could have done if we'd had a nuclear war. Now we're at the point where it's clear that unless we are more careful than we've ever been before, we will smash the place up. In fact, we are smashing the place up at very high speed. In fact, I realized recently, most of the planet smashing that humans have ever engaged in has gone on during the course of my career, actually. That gives you an idea of the speed at which we are accelerating. And the other thing that I want to emphasize about this Anthropocene is that it's a completely new context for us to be in. Everything about how we do life, how we solve problems, how we do economics, how we do our politics, how we do our education, how we run society, our attitude to technology, everything you can think of has been honed in an era when the world was still a robust place for us to just do whatever we wanted. And now that that's changed, it gives us urgently the question, which bits of how we do life are still fit for purpose, and which bits urgently need a rework in order to become Anthropocene fit. And the subtitle to my book was a handbook for the make or break years. And the reason for that is because right now, these really are the make or break years. We've had a few decades of being in this Anthropocene and being able to get away, broadly speaking, with living as if we weren't. But what's clear about right now is that we're either capable of making this transition pretty well immediately, or else we're going to head for some pretty dark times. And nobody knows the details exactly of how that's going to happen. Will it be a biodiversity crisis first that suddenly impacts the food system, or will it be climate change impacts first, or will it be some mixture of the two, or will it not look like climate change or biodiversity at all, but just look like a destabilization of global culture and a global society, and maybe it'll just look like a war. But it looks pretty clear that the system, the kind of stable system that we've had, is really starting to wobble pretty badly. And it looks likely that if we can't take some strong action to change the way we go about doing life, it looks likely that we're going to head for some pretty bad trouble. So that's it. Here we are in the Anthropocene. Don't worry, I'll try and make sure this isn't a depressing talk, because the good news is that there is plenty we can do about it. It's just some of it is different kinds of things than the sorts of things that many people often expect. So what's it like in this Anthropocene that we're in? Well, the first thing to say is we're not just facing one challenge at a time. We talk a lot about a climate emergency, but actually the climate emergency is just one symptom of us not living carefully enough on this planet of ours. We also have a biodiversity crisis, which is just as serious, but we don't talk about it as much. We also have, linked to that, food security problems. In fact, I've got a slide on some of this stuff. So, these are just some of the physical challenges that we're up against. A climate emergency, an energy transition that needs to go with it, food security problems, a rising population. We've got some good news there, actually. The latest analysis of that looks as though actually the population might top out a little bit lower than we had been thinking. Maybe somewhere around 8.5 billion is the kind of latest piece of research on that. We've got a biodiversity crisis. Meanwhile, we've got all kinds of pollution problems, of which plastics is the one we see and hear about the most, but of course there are loads of other pollutants as well that are pretty serious. And we've got a whole load of disease threats, from antibiotic resistance to diseases that might be coming out of the way that we're running our food system. So all these things need dealing with together. It's no good just dealing with one at a time, moving from one problem to the next. And I think this brings me to my first link with the challenges facing the Morecambe Bay partnership, because one of the things that we urgently need to learn to do as humans is get much better at joining things up and doing that systemic thinking. So if there's anyone on the call who's kind of got, a particular soapbox about one, cares particularly about one aspect of Morecambe Bay, whether it's the marine life or the energy or something to do with the community or whatever, what I would encourage all of you to do is do your very best to have a proper understanding of the whole system, and the way that all these competing and different elements fit together, so that when you're taking decisions in the interests of one aspect of it, you're actually not doing that at all. You're looking at the whole system and asking what is most mutually beneficial for the whole system on every step of the way. Okay, I've got some good news about these words that are in green here, which is that from a scientific and technical perspective, they are challenging and there's a lot of complexity in it, but actually there's nothing stopping us. Broadly speaking, we have the science and technology to be able to transition our energy supply, to deal with our carbon emissions, to sustainably feed a rising population, whilst doing that, to manage our biodiversity. All these things, it turns out not to be the science and technology that's the bottleneck. And so if you think of this little diagram on the page at the moment as 3 layers of an onion, I've just shown you the outer layer, and we'll come later to some of the stuff that's in some of the inner layers. But for the moment, let's just have a look at how we're getting on with our response to some of the stuff in green. And I'll begin with the climate. And I don't want to talk about it too much because I know we all hear a load about climate emergency. I've just come back from 4 days down at Extinction Rebellion's big demonstrations in London, by the way. So I've sort of been hearing all about it down there. But let's have a look at how we're getting on. So let's have a look at this graph of annual carbon dioxide emissions, with the black line being emissions from fossil fuel, and the little line at the bottom being emissions from land use change, and then the sort of more reddy line at the top being the sum of the two. But let's have a look at the black line for a second, because the science on climate change has been crystal clear for decades now that it's a huge thing. And we've had 27 COPs. And so let's have a look at what you can tell for how we're getting on from this curve or this line. So if you were on Mars looking at data about planet Earth to try and understand what's been going on for this funny species of humans down there, you'd see from this graph that some things had happened over the years. You'd be able to see that something happened just after 1980. There's a little dip in the black line there. And sure enough, that correlates with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And if you go on a bit further, you'd say, oh, crumbs, there was a sharp little dent there in about 2008, wasn't there? Okay, something must have happened to humans then. Well, that was our financial crisis. And then if you look a bit further, of course, you see a bigger dent. Well, wow, something around 2000, something really big must have happened. Well, we had a pandemic. But what you wouldn't see from this curve is if you were on Mars, you'd be thinking, the funny thing about it is that those humans, they haven't spotted climate change yet, have they? Because there's no evidence whatsoever from this curve that humans have noticed that climate change might be something we should be doing something about. And that's pretty shocking, because we've had 27 COPs, and the science has been crystal clear, and we all know it's a big deal. So why is that? This is the crunch question. Why is it that we're making, and I'm choosing my words carefully, we're making practically and maybe exactly zero progress so far? So what's going on? Actually, I'll come to that in a sec. I'll just talk about some of the early symptoms that we're getting of not having managed to tame that carbon curve yet. So we hear about a lot of this. We see storm damage and flood damage, and there's wildfires, and there's melting ice. And down in the bottom right there, we've got desertification of arable land, meaning it's no longer as productive for producing crops for humans. And then in the center there, the picture of the puddles at the top, those are craters in Siberia where methane has exploded out of the melting permafrost, leaving holes in the ground up to 50 meters across. So those are some of the things that are going on so far at about 1.2 degrees worth of temperature rise so far. And one of the things that we don't talk about anything like enough, and the scientific community is just starting to really get its head together and say, look, we need to look at this much more carefully. And there was a paper in Nature about this a few months ago, saying what we haven't modeled, all the climate models that we've got, what they don't do is a proper job of looking at how these effects might interact with each other and what sort of tipping points might cascade to trigger what other tipping points. So in other words, when the methane boils up out of the permafrost, that's a very powerful greenhouse gas going into the air, which makes the atmosphere warmer, which makes the forest more likely to catch fire, which releases more carbon dioxide, which makes it warmer again, which means that we're more likely to have more ice melting, which means that the Earth becomes less reflective, so it absorbs more sunlight, so it makes it warm up a bit more, which makes a bit more permafrost a bit more methane explode out of melting permafrost again, and so on. And at what point do we reach a tipping point at which these positive feedback loops get out of control, and we reach a point at which actually the temperature is going to keep going up, even if we totally stop burning fossil fuel or releasing other greenhouse gases? And we actually don't know about, as we don't know anything like enough about that kind of thing. And it looks likely that if we take very strong action now, we'll probably, broadly speaking, as a species, get away with it. Although it's definite that the symptoms are going to get worse. Absolutely, whatever we do, they're going to get quite significantly worse before we can stabilize things. So that's the situation we're in. And so, I would sum it up by saying we are accelerating into a polycrisis. And when I say accelerating into it, it's because just to have a look at that curve again, the height of that curve is the speed at which we're running into the problem. So it's not just that every year we're still emitting carbon. Actually, every year we're emitting more carbon than we were the year before. We're racing towards trouble faster and faster every year. We're speeding up at the moment still in our mad charge towards a really dark place. So why is that? Well, I put some other pictures on this slide now. At the top right, I've just got a picture of a balloon being squeezed to try and illustrate the way that the global system dynamics work. And the phenomenon, which is that if a few people cut their carbon, or a few countries cut their carbon, or a few businesses cut their carbon, the unfortunate reality is that it creates a nasty tendency at the global system level for the rest of the world just to somehow absorb the slack through a myriad of rebound effects. And I wrote one of my books quite a lot about this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying this to be depressing, but it does tell us that it's not enough just to have some piecemeal actions. Actually, what we need to have is we need to interrupt the global dynamics of climate change at the global system level, and nothing else will do. We need to do something kind of really quite, make some really fundamental intervention, like putting some kind of brake on the rate at which the fossil fuel comes out of the ground. And then the pictures of those people with their heads in the sand and asleep at their laptops, that's just my illustration of the amazing psychology that we're up against. But I would say that that head that's in the sand has probably pulled its way up the first millimeter so far. And if you think of trying to get that head out of the sand, the first millimeter would be the hardest one. And it's very hard to tell how much more pushing it takes to get that head properly out of the sand. But it might be that we're only, if we all pull hard now, we might be a very short space of time away from the moment at which suddenly the conditions are ready, and we are ready to all wake up together and for the first time start making the response to the climate emergency that we need to make. At the moment, we're not in that position. And I've just come back from 4 days down in London with Extinction Rebellion and others. And there were, I don't know, there may have been 100,000 of us down there. There were a lot of us, and but barely reported in the papers. And one of the things that's clearly coming out of that is a very deep sense that this is incredibly frustrating, and something needs to happen. And it's not good enough just to wait a bit longer and hope and keep asking nicely and hope that something's going to happen. So that kind of sense that we're really ready to wake up, for me, is stronger than it's ever been. I'd like to hope so. Why else? Well, let's have a look at some other reasons why. Well, I spent a day on Friday outside Tufton Street, which is the home of deeply cynical far-right think tanks, climate denial think tanks, that are very consciously and deliberately spreading what they know is misinformation in order to allow the fossil fuel coming out of the ground. So we've been victim of a lot of fake news, which has got a lot of influence on the media. It's downright corruption. There's greenwashing. There's a ton of greenwashing. And all of this has helped to keep our heads in the sand. So one thing I would say to you all in the Morecambe Partnership is, please resist all of this as much as you possibly can. And in particular, it can be so tempting in all sorts of contexts to kind of greenwash a little bit and say you're doing all the right things when actually you're just putting a few sticky plasters on what's a big systemic problem. And I would encourage you all to be really alert to all of that. And also to call out fake news or corruption or anything that's disingenuous as loudly as you possibly can. I'm going to come on to more of that later. Okay, I'm going to do a very quick tour of some of the technical solutions that we've got, but I'm going to make it really, really quick, and I'm not going to go through all the detail. But I just want to illustrate the point that we've got the technical solutions to some of these things. So here's my little sketch of the technical solution to energy and climate. And here it is without any words on it, or not many words on it yet. And I've just tried to draw all these boxes to scale. I'll fill some of them in a minute with labels. But broadly speaking, in order to have a sustainable energy supply, we've got to find clean ways of generating energy, converting it into a form we can store it in, storing it, transporting it so that it gets to the people who need it when they need it, probably storing it a bit again, converting it into the form we can for end use, and then finally we need the technology to use it for the things we need to use it for. And I've drawn these boxes roughly to scale to how important I think they are. And you see the red box down there, that's the most important one, but it's the one we talk about the least. And it is demand reduction. The most important thing in all this is that we reduce the total amount of energy that we need, that we use. The fossil fuel companies don't want to hear that story. They keep telling us that their job is to meet our rising energy needs. We don't have rising energy needs. We have diminishing energy needs because we're becoming more efficient at everything you could think of. But it's important that we bag the savings and use less energy, because renewable energy on its own doesn't actually save the planet. It only helps us if it replaces the fossil fuel. And at the moment, we're having more renewable energy at the same time as we're having more fossil fuel because we're growing our total energy supply. So demand reduction is not talked about anything like enough. And it's the most important thing on this whole page. Let's have a look at the other really big hitters. At the global level, our biggest energy supply is going to be solar power. That's not the case for the United Kingdom. And other things like wind and tidal and so on are really significant, especially for us here in the UK. We don't talk really enough yet about hydrogen, which has got a massive role to play in all this, because hydrogen allows us to store the energy in electricity by using it to generate hydrogen. And then hydrogen is difficult to transport it, but we can, it's possible. And then hydrogen is also useful at the end use stage. And then at the bottom, I've got that little black box that says DAX. And I've tried to draw that to scale. That's for direct air carbon capture and storage. That's the non-nature-based ways of taking carbon back out of the air. And it is significant, but I've drawn it, I hope, roughly to scale. It's not a game changer. It's one of the tricks we can play to ease the situation slightly, but it's not the big silver bullet that some people are trying to tell us that it is. And they're trying to tell us that it is because it allows, by telling us that it is, it makes us feel more comfortable about digging the fossil fuel in the ground, out of the ground. Okay. And then there's a whole load more words there that I'm not even going to talk through because we'd be here all night. But I'm going to move straight on and talk about the technical solution to food and land, because in our food and land system we need to feed a rising population better than ever, at the same time as looking after the biodiversity that's currently hemorrhaging, and at the same time as dealing with climate change. And that also turns out to be doable. It's really challenging. The complexity of it is, and the scientific uncertainty around what causes what in the land is still pretty significant. But here's my simple little map. And on the left-hand side, I've got things that are ready to go. And on the right-hand side, I've got things that are more at the R&D stage. And again, I've tried to draw things roughly to scale. So what do we need? So ready to go right now in yellow there is a movement towards plant-based diets. We don't necessarily all have to go vegan or vegetarian, but the science is really clear-cut that we take a lot of pressure off the food system by transitioning towards in the direction, a long way in the direction of plant-based diets, because it's so inefficient having animals in the food system. At the moment, we're getting human digestible food in the form of animal feed. We're feeding it to animals, and the animals are giving us back a small proportion of that energy, of that nutrition in the form of meat and dairy. They're also using up an awful lot of land, and they're also having huge greenhouse gas emissions. There are some places where some kind of stocking, and some kind of sustainable, low stocking density animals are the right thing to do. But we need, as clear cut, we need a lot less of it. Moving across on the right, land restoration, we need to find ways of just restoring land. Sometimes that's rewilding, sometimes that's some kind of hybrid between food production and wildlife. We need agroecology, which is this kind of emerging art and craft and science of how to get high yields out of possibly poor quality land without using fertilizer and pesticide. And it's through mixed crops and rotations and robot weeders and all sorts of stuff. And it's very complex. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of people to do that right. And then on the right-hand side, two things. The first is perennial crops that where we can grow where we don't have to plow the field up every year, because that's desperate for the soil carbon and the soil ecosystem. And finally on the right is that is the emerging science of creating food without the use of photosynthesis at all. In a lab or a factory or whatever you want to call it, but you take energy and you use energy and a laboratory process to produce protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And it turns out to be somewhere of the order of about 100 times more efficient than using photosynthesis in plants in terms of the land that's required to produce a certain amount of food. And that efficiency saving is going to be critical for us in preserving our biodiversity and creating an energy supply and dealing with climate change. And then finally at the bottom, in blue, we have to limit population growth. And the good news about that is that it happens automatically if we sort out education, eliminate extreme poverty, and sort out women's rights. What you find out is that in country after country, if you can do all those things, then the population sorts itself out. Okay, I've talked about a bit about very quickly about the technical solutions to some of the physical challenges we've got, and they're all doable. So what stops us implementing these technically solved challenges? And, I could talk, if we had till midnight, I could talk more about all of these, but, that takes us to these words in purple. It's unsurprising that an economic framework that's been broadly honed pre-Anthropocene is in need of a major tweak to be Anthropocene fit. The role of business in the Anthropocene is completely different. The businesses I'm working with, this agenda affects everything that a business says, thinks, and does, including its core purpose. There's no room in the world today to have businesses that don't exist primarily for the health of people and planet. So a massive change in the business agenda. Politics, crumbs, you don't need to look far to see that we need a better quality of politics and a better culture of politics within this country and definitely abroad as well, in order to be able to even begin dealing sensibly with these global systemic challenges. I'll talk more about that in a second. Our media is doing us an incredible disservice at the moment. I include the BBC in that, and I include most of what we would have traditionally called newspapers, because they are strongly influenced either by billionaire owners or by the kind of misinformation machine that's coming out of think tanks like Tufton Street that have very strong access to the media and are capable of putting stories out into the headlines of the most read newspapers pretty well at will to suit whatever need they like, and keeping some things out of the papers. So you have 100,000 people on the streets outside Parliament at the weekend, and it barely hits the newspapers. And it barely hits the BBC either. That's a whole sort of new subject again. Related to economics, questions about growth. Clearly we have to be much more circumspect about which things we keep growing and our whole orientation to growth. And that whole GDP growth narrative is very clearly totally unhelpful for us. We can't keep growing our energy supply or our carbon emissions. There's all sorts of impacts that we need to stop growing. But it is still good to try and grow our biodiversity if we could even begin to grow that. Huge questions for education and the way we're bringing up our kids into the world, not only to understand the science and so on, but to be able to think in the ways and have the values that will enable us to thrive in this Anthropocene. Investment, all the trillions need to be pushing in the right direction. Inequality, I'm not going to talk about at length but it's so important. I just want to say now that there are 8 billion of us on this planet. We're on one boat together, like it or not, and we will sink or swim together, like it or not. And somehow we have to find a way of treating each other with a level of respect that allows us to all be properly on the same side, feeling as if we're on the same, we're on the same side, fighting each other's corner. So that's why the inequality thing is, whilst we've had ages of not dealing with inequality, we have to now. And our relationship with technology is also interesting, because whilst technology has brought us so many wonderful things, it's also true to say that technology has taken us to a very dangerous place. It's also true to say that we need some technologies like crazy to get us through the situation we're in. But what we need is a new relationship with technology that is capable of being much more discerning about which technologies we're going to run with, because we've decided carefully that they are good for people and planet, and which ones we're going to leave on the shelf, because although they give us yet another efficiency improvement, if they're not good for people and planet, we need the discipline somehow to be able to leave them on the shelf. Okay, that's a quick tour of the words in purple. What's right at the very center? And I think for me, this is the crunch of it all. And I'm going to write my next book about this kind of stuff, because it seems pretty clear to me, and it's amazing how many scientists and technical experts have said similar things. Actually, probably what's most important, can I get my clicker to work? Yeah, is the values that we hold. That there are some values which we absolutely have to have as cultural norms now, if we are going to survive the Anthropocene. And there are some values with which we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And the good news about values is that the evidence is that humans are capable of cultivating values as cultural norms and at the individual level through our deliberate effort. So I'm going to write about these now because I think it's clear cut that we absolutely need them. And they're probably the most important thing in here. Some of the values I'm about to talk about now, if I look at the decisions that are badly made in this country, such as whether or not to have a coal mine off the west coast of Cumbria, actually they boil down to failings, core failings in some of these values. So let's have a look at what they are. And I'm just going to be very simple about it. I just think we need to get much better at respecting all people within this country and in other countries, whether they live on land or whether they're in a boat trying to get from one country to another, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're whatever part of society they're in, whatever. We have to get much stronger at this principle of respecting everybody equally for their inherent value as a human. I'm going to talk more about that in just a sec. We have to get better at respecting the environment. I'm not going to talk about that so much because I think we can kind of take it as read. We need to be so much more careful with that. And we need to respect the truth much more passionately than we have been doing. And I'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, this respect for people, getting slightly conscious of time, so I'm going to try and talk a bit quickly, but we have to do better than this. So, here we are in the 5th richest country in the world or something. And we've got people unable to keep themselves warm with houses covered in damp. We've got people in desperate situations coming across on boats, putting their lives at risk. We've got food banks in this all over the place in this massively rich country of ours. So picture on the top on the right is just a picture of, it's actually not this country, it's a jail in Louisiana. I looked at the prison statistics for around the world, and I found that if you were a male born in Louisiana, you will on average spend 90 weeks of your life in prison. And the reason for that, and you don't have to be black for that to be the case, you just have to be an average male born in Louisiana. And the reason for that is that prisons are a profit-making business in the United States. So, on the one hand, there's that desperate lack of respect for so many people. And then on the other hand, we've got a few pictures on the bottom side of the screen, half of the screen. Denise Coates receiving her MBE there for services to the community. She makes £340 million a year through her gambling business that makes its profits not by people enjoying a bit of a flutter on the races. She makes her living by absolutely ripping people's lives apart. We have Rupert Murdoch, who was right behind, for example, Fox News putting out stories that it knew full well absolutely weren't true about corruption in the US elections. And he's behind that. And he is also the owner of some very popular papers in the United Kingdom. So I've got a suggestion for everybody on this call, please. If you think the newspaper that you read is owned by Rupert Murdoch or any other billionaire who has a vested interest or a track record of deliberately pushing things that they know aren't true, can I ask you to please, please, please switch your media and get your information from elsewhere. We have Elon Musk, who is he's done some good things, but he's also ripping Twitter apart at the moment. And along with Jeff Bezos, is squandering his spare billions on space tourism, which, if I had more time, I'd talk about why space tourism is a complete self-indulgence and has no practical purpose at all. But the picture of Jeff Bezos is him thanking his Amazon workers who are on minimum wage or less sometimes, for their help in enabling him to indulge in his space tourism hobby, which is probably the most carbon intensive, most carbon unfriendly way that I can think of anybody squandering any spare income. For speed, I'll miss out some of the other faces there. I'll just mention Shell's record profits. Okay, so that's why we have to do so much better on the respect thing. And when we vote for politicians, a question to ask is, how do I think they stand on their respect for all the people of the world? What's their track record? What's the evidence for that? So back to my 3 again. Let's move on. I'm going to just talk a bit about truth and trust. And if I'm just about to start writing a book about why this is so important and how we can get more of it, because we've got to get much, much sharper at asking serious questions about which of these people and media channels we can trust to be careful with the truth. I don't just mean not lying, but which of these are enabling us to have an accurate version of the truth as best they can understand it, and which of them aren't. And we need to become less tolerant of the ones who are careless, and less tolerant and more rewarding the ones who are careful with it. So I'm not going to answer any specific questions, but I just want to say this. If somebody, and this is not a party political statement, but if somebody were to have a track record, a known track record of carelessness with the truth and downright lies, having been sacked a couple of times from previous jobs for lying, and then they were found to have been dishonest a number of occasions in their job, then not only would they be unfit for that job if it was a responsible job like a politician, but also anybody else who was a colleague of theirs who knew about that and stayed quiet about it and didn't have an issue with it was also propagating that carelessness, that culture of carelessness with truth that we absolutely have to do better than. So I'm going to do a quick advert now for a little scheme which is just embryonic. But if there's anybody on this call who's thinking, I want to see a culture of truth coming into British politics, there is a nice little scheme, you can Google it, called MP Watch, which is apolitical. And it's just trying to hold MPs to account so that at the next election, all MPs and candidates in key constituencies will understand the track record of truthfulness of all of the MPs and the candidates, specifically around the questions of climate. So for me, this is one of the really high leverage things that anyone who wanted to push for a better world could very practically get involved in. Okay, so that's the 3 things, and I'm going to finish with a few quick words on Morecambe. So, because the question is, when it's all so global, what can Morecambe Bay do? And for me, the answer is, the way to answer that question is to ask, how can we help create the conditions under which humanity can undergo the systemic change that it so urgently needs? So it's a big and empowering question. It's not just kind of how can we look after our carbon footprint. And so I think first thing is to imagine how good things could be. Imagine how fabulous the whole Morecambe Bay area could be if you got all these things right. And so this is a non-Morecambe Bay picture for you. I have got some Morecambe Bay pictures in a second, but we can all imagine this differently. We don't spend enough time building up positive images of what the future could be like, positive enough to get excited about. So that's imagining it. Second thing is to role model it as best we can. None of us are perfect, but to try to role model it as best we can, and especially I would think for Morecambe, role model the process of a kind of inclusive process that involves everybody, considers all perspectives, is really democratic, and is really systemic in the way that you treat the issues. Get away from one group fighting for one thing that is a particular cause they're passionate about, while they conflict with another group that's fighting for another cause they're passionate about. Try and look at the whole thing altogether, as if everybody's on the same side from all perspectives. Develop that culture of Anthropocene fit thinking and those values. And some of those values, around truthfulness, I think one of them would be, this would be just a challenging thing I just mentioned, is avoid, I see so much greenwashing in some quite unpleasant some quite unpleasant businesses. Avoid a situation in which a business that hasn't got a good track record for its ethics is propping up its reputation through funding something that looks nice, like the Morecambe Bay Partnership. Exert your influence in all the ways you can. Ask yourself what those ways are. You've got a community, you've got tourists, you've got farmers, you've got a voice to government, you've got research that you can be a role model to other local areas. There's so many ways in which you can have that influence. And then finally, just more widely on the climate and ecological emergency, we need to start learning to become really insistent, because we have to have this change. It's going to be desperate if we don't get it very, very soon. Which is why this question, I think, and I don't say this at all lightly, but if there's the right kind of protest, we have to get the change, because we're going to such a dark place if we don't. So, Morecambe Bay in the what's its response to the Anthropocene challenge? It's about putting all these things together in a very holistic picture and seeing how they relate to each other and keeping the thinking very, very systemic. So, and remembering, so wind turbines, they have good things about them. They produce renewable energy. As I've said, renewable energy doesn't do us any good on its own. It only does us any good when we're using it to replace rather than augment fossil fuel. Same with tidal. But so many different ways in which you can exert a positive influence. And can you make Morecambe Bay an area where there's a real sense of integration and coherence in response to this Anthropocene challenge? Final slide. I just want to say that I want to leave everybody with a sense that we are in this race between tipping points. Will the climate tipping point, will the climate and ecological tipping point come first? Will we have a kind of ecological and societal meltdown that will take us to a very, very challenging place first? Or will the human tipping point happen first? Will we, by all pushing together and showing how it's done and being role models and insisting on high qualities of truth and respect and so on, and modeling it, will we be able to bring about the social tipping point first, in which humans wake up, we get on the case, and then suddenly things that have seemed impossible to make happen will all suddenly become much, much easier. I'm confident of that. If we wake up, we will suddenly find we make progress in a way that's never been possible at all in my lifetime. So that's a lot of stuff. I've talked for easily long enough. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Mike. That was brilliant. Lots and lots of very, very thought-provoking stuff there. I'm kind of looking forward to this discussion, which I think could be a little bit different to some of the other ones that we normally have. So please, if you've got any questions, or if you've been sort of stimulated, or I don't know if you've got any local examples or anything, then please put your comments in the chat feed, and over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be putting them to Mike. I've got a couple as well, but this was an inevitable one, Mike. I think this first one from Chris, particularly because you showed an image of a big tidal barrage going over something that may or may not have been. Don't think it was Morecambe Bay, but what's your current feelings and thoughts about a tidal barrage across Morecambe Bay?
Okay, so I'm going to stay out of making a specific yes or no judgment on it. I'll just talk very slightly about the way in which that decision should be made. So the first thing to say is that just because it's a change doesn't necessarily mean that it's the wrong thing, right? It will change the ecosystem somewhat. That on in itself doesn't necessarily mean it's definitely a bad thing. I think the reality is that there's really not much, there are not many places in the world where we can say, it's nature as it always was. So because it's a change, that might not necessarily mean that we shouldn't do it. And then after that, I would just say as with many things, it's about weighing up. It's about weighing up pros and cons of different things. There will be some hit for wildlife. There will be some benefits for wildlife. It's always tempting to think that we understand. One of the things to be careful about is when we make a change, it's tempting to think we understand all the consequences. We usually don't. Against all that, there's also things like connecting up Barrow and an energy supply and all the arguments for. And what I would encourage is a discussion on that, in which, as I've said a couple of times already today, in which we get away from people having their own corner and we get towards everybody trying to look at every perspective in the round so that we're optimizing the trade-offs between the different things.
Good. Okay, that's good. Very, very diplomatic answer, I would say. Thank you. So yeah, I knew that we were going to be getting into some kind of deep, complicated stuff here, because obviously you're anchoring this in the whole planet, so you're going to get all sorts of questions, Mike. I can see already. This is quite a good one to get us started, though, actually, because I think you'll know the answer, and sort of goes back to the beginning of your talk. So Nikki asks, when you're looking at emissions, so carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, are the statistics that are normally compiled, I guess, from yourself and IPCC and people, do they include the outputs of environmental disasters, so things like the melting permafrost and the forest fires that are going to be, I guess, increasingly happening as a result of climate change?
Yeah, well, we look at different kinds of emissions in different ways. So we do look at total emissions, but usually, mostly it turns out to be anthropogenic, whether it's land-based or whether it's whether it's from the land system or whether it's from the burning of fossil fuel or whatever. But all those things are looked at together. But the biggest one in the whole deal is the stuff that humans cause. The biggest deal is through the burning of fossil fuel. But you're absolutely you're right in terms of the land-based stuff. We look at both. We look at the stuff that comes out of human managed activities, and we look at negative emissions from well-managed land or land that humans aren't even doing anything with at all. And the good news is that if we get that right, there is a good chunk of carbon that we can take back out of the air again.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really good question. I've never heard this question asked before, actually, and it's something which I wasn't even aware had happened. So there's a question here from Elizabeth, who asks, the rise in disinformation and fake news. She's sort of linking that to the disbanding of the Central Office of Information by the government in 2010. And she's basically saying, did that have a role? It was apolitical and it had a sort of role in keeping departments in check. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that.
Well, there are people who know a lot more about the details of some of the sort of unwinding of checks and balances that we've had over the recent years. But what I would say is, but one of the things that's been going on is based out of 55 Tufton Street, where I spent Friday picketing and doing talks, along with many other people. There are some so-called think tanks which are funded by, for example, the fossil fuel industry. And their job is very cynically, Nigel Lawson founded all this stuff, famous climate denier. And they are very cynically pushing out a mixture of denial of some things, confusion around some other things. And they're very sophisticated in how they get messages out. They've got very good access to a lot of the press. So they're very successful at getting articles out there, onto the front pages. And they're also very successful at lobbying MPs. So, we're looking at, I think it's easy to think of ourselves as having a sort of nice, free democracy. But actually, over the last, I don't know if it's 10 or 15 years, there's been really quite an alarming unpicking of that. And it's nothing like what most people imagine that it is, in terms of a kind of free society with good access to information, and law-abiding, MPs going about their work outside of, free from vested interests. It's just, that's not the world that we're in at all, and we've got to row back from it. So that's why I put that MP Watch advert up there, because I think it's one of the highest leverage things that any of us could do, is to take part in an initiative that is trying to just really flush out the various forms of dishonesty. Most of it isn't outright lies, but I'll give you an example of it. I think it's so important. It's quite local as well. So when Michael Gove came to his judgment that the coal mine off the west coast of Cumbria should go ahead, he said he looked at the evidence and decided, and that was what it told him. Well, what he did was he looked selectively at some of the evidence. He looked at the evidence that was supplied by the West Cumbria coal mine that had a clear vested interest. He looked at the evidence that was supplied by a guy who made his living promoting the Australian coal industry, who was funded by the coal mine, who didn't have any expertise, particularly in climate or the steel industry or economics or any of the things that were relevant to the discussion. And what he ignored was that Becky Willis and I put together a piece against the coal mine that the Green Alliance published, and then West Cumbria coal mine produced a rebuttal to that, and then Becky Willis and I, with help from others, put together a rebuttal to that rebuttal, which included properly really sound evidence-based, really solid evidence. Anytime we didn't have the evidence to hand ourselves directly, we got in touch with top economics professors, chief execs of steel companies, anyone you could think of. And we lined it all up, line by line, annihilated practically every word of what they'd said. And the standard of rigor in that analysis was just immeasurably higher than the stuff that Michael Gove used, right? So what he's guilty of is deliberately, well, possibly you could argue that technically he could have done it accidentally, but it's extremely unlikely. So what he's done is he has deliberately selected bogus evidence over high quality evidence. That's incredibly dishonest. And actually that act alone, to my mind, and I'm not being party political about this, but that would leave him and anybody who stands by him completely unfit to be an MP.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I think what is, I'm not expecting you to come back on this either, actually, but just one thing that I think is fascinating is that the politician you've just mentioned is actually one of the ones who, out of everyone, spent an awful lot of time listening to environmentalists when he became Secretary of State for the Environment, a lot more than a lot of the other recent people who've held that particular office of state. So if it can happen with him, it can sort of happen with anyone. Right. I'm just going to say a quick disclaimer at this point, which I think I've ever had to do on any of these talks. Some of you will be aware, I think, that as charities, we're governed by the Charity Commission, and we do have to be incredibly careful that we are not allowed to say anything that is basically party political. So what we're not allowed to do is we're not allowed to say, you know, who you should vote for. We're not allowed to say comments that are in favor of any political party. We are allowed to say things like what Mike said earlier on is, you know, given that there are local elections coming up, you know, we would encourage people, you know, we can encourage people to sort of look at the voting record of MPs or their kind of environment, you know, their kind of environmental policies. But what we're not allowed to do is to sort of do anything on that would be encouraging people to vote for any particular side. So the reason I mention that is because there are some brilliant questions here that I think, given that this is on a Morecambe partnership platform, we've got to be really, really careful about. I've never had to say that before, but of course it's because of the really, really deep issues you're triggering. So what I would say is that if you've got any, if you would like to follow up any of these questions in a space which is not being hosted by a charity and the rules we're governed by, then I would encourage you to get in touch with Mike. Presumably, you're on social media, Mike?
I'm very reluctantly on Twitter. I occasionally tweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. But,
okay. So
I mean, I want to emphasize, I do my very best not to be party political on anything, and what I've tried to describe as principles, but it's difficult to avoid a specific example of something that happened, and if that person happened to be from a political party, well,
yeah. So what I think I can do, though, is there's a couple of questions I'm going to link together here, which I think you've started talking about a little bit with MP Watch. So Paul says that one of the problems is that politicians have a very short-term election cycle, and therefore they want to sort of please the electorate without looking at the bigger picture. And then there's David says that in his home, they're always complaining about the current batch of politicians. But his is the crucial question, which is how can we as a nation better develop more aware and less self-interested politicians who are kind of more interested in the bigger picture? And I think, given that we are in a run-up to local elections, that is something which, if you want to answer that around the politicians, maybe if you want to answer that around us as voters, whoever we vote for.
So I think we should ask ourselves really carefully about the core qualities of the people who are on the ballot paper. And I put up 3 values, and I think they are absolutely critical, and they are more important than any of the specifics that you might hear in their policies or whatever. So the first is, do you think you've got really solid, well-founded evidence that this person cares about the environment, properly cares about the environment? Do you think this person have you got good evidence to say that this person is respectful of other people, has empathy for other people, is compassionate about other people within this country and around the world, whether or not it will get them elected, whether or not it is good for the people just in their constituency? We are 8 billion on this planet now together. Are you, to put it incredibly simply, are you voting for somebody who's kind or not? We don't talk about whether politicians are kind or not at all, but actually it's a really critical quality that we have to have more of in politics. And then finally, this question of truth, just be really, really discerning. Is this person careful with the truth? Have they always been careful with the truth? And one thing I would say about that is that if somebody is careless with the truth, either by being pushing out things, it's unlikely to be clear-cut lies, but it's much more likely to be misdirections of attention or stating things in a way that implies something is true when it's not true. or creates a false impression, or misdirects our attention away from towards something trivial that looks good, make big it out into a big thing, and actually taking our attention away from something big that's much more important. But ask us really careful questions. Is this person careful to put us in the picture as best they can? And if they've ever slipped up very deliberately on that one, the chances are, what you know about that is that if they've done it once, you can't trust them ever on any other subject not to do it again. So, and if they've kept quiet about their colleagues in the same way, then you can't trust them either. So, it's asking really careful, much sharper questions about who we can and can't trust, and voting, voting accordingly.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in my day job is I work for Lancaster Wildlife Trust, so I'm the CEO there. When we had the Defend Nature sort of campaigns in autumn of last year under the sort of the Truss government, one of the things that we were encouraging people to do there was to write to local MPs, and it made a huge amount of difference. I mean, there were sort of thousands of people writing, and it doesn't again really matter what colour of the spectrum your local MP happens to be. It was proving to the opposition parties that there were votes in people who cared about the environment, and actually most MPs will respond. So if you're concerned about sewage, for instance, ending up in Morecambe Bay, as one person clearly is here, or if you're concerned about whether sea level rise or local policies, if you write to your MP, every letter that is received is showing that their constituents care about that issue and that there are votes in it. And some of this is quite big when you think about the size of some of the MPs' majorities. It's not huge up here, doesn't tend to be. So I think for every letter that's written, there's an assumption, isn't there, that there's a whole load of others kind of underneath the surface of the iceberg who feel the same thing. So I think that is a really, really strong thing that everyone can do.
So don't just vote according to what you care about. Let them know that that's what you care about well in advance of the election.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly. Now there are far too many questions, and they're all too big that we're not going to get them all done by 8:30. There was a good one here though, Giles, that I think is a good question, because there's a big question here and also quite a specific local question. So Giles says, there's almost no chance of sticking to 1.5 degrees of average global temperature rise. So why do we keep talking as if it's still possible? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second part is also your thoughts on the role of local councils. So you've focused a lot on really big issues of truth and media and getting the politicians that you deserve and all of that sort of stuff. But local government and the role of local councils, that tends to be the level that we operate more at. Certainly those of us involved in Morecambe Bay Partnership. So a big question, and then a more local question for you.
Yeah, okay. So 1.5 degrees. So the first thing is to say, I don't know if this is cause for much optimism or not, but it's not yet physically impossible for us to stay within 1.5 degrees. It's just, and we could do it without mass suffering. It's just that what it would take would be a kind of response that is so unlike anything we've even begun to experience that it feels unlikely. But who knows, if we really did properly wake up tomorrow, actually 1.5 would still be on the cards, and a better, higher quality of life with it as well, if we really, really got things right. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that we talk about 1.5 as if it's some sort of line in the sand, and in one sense it is, and in one sense it isn't. It is a line in the sand in the sense that what we shouldn't do is just go, oh, well, we can't make 1.5. Well, never mind, let's just try and do 1.6. Oh, well, we make 1.6. Never mind, let's just try and do 1.7. And just let it slip and slip and slip and slip. So we should make it, if we get to the point where we can't do 1.5, it should be a huge alarm bell. Oh my God, we've blown that one, right? So in the one sense, we shouldn't we shouldn't just think, oh, well, 1.5, 2 sounds a little bit like 1.5, doesn't it? What's the difference? Actually, what the science is telling us is the difference in terms of risk is massive. And there's a sense in which 1.5 isn't a hard line in the science, in the sand, in the sense, which is that actually we often talk as though we know what the consequences of different temperature changes are, but we don't. The science of that is really, really uncertain. We've got a load of modeling that is more or less assumes that there's going to be relatively linear changes of one thing with another, and that nothing's going to tip, nothing's going to go catastrophic, nothing's going to nothing's going to be unpredictable, and we're not going to encounter any bits of science that we haven't yet quite, any scientific phenomena that we haven't quite understood yet. And that's a very flawed, that's a very shaky assumption. So what's really going on is that we're throwing the dice more and more all the time. And we're already throwing the dice. We don't know whether, if humanity were to never burn another lump of coal, oil or gas, we don't know whether we haven't already tipped something, right? We think it's pretty, we think we'd probably get away with it, but we don't know for sure. And we don't know for sure that we couldn't go for 2 degrees and still somehow sort of hobble through and get away with it and find a way of adjusting our societies, and it might broadly be all right, possibly. It's it's unlikely, probably. But what we do know for sure is that we're throwing the dice more and more. And then if you really want to look at the uncertainty, what we really, really don't understand is the way in which the pressure we put on global society through climate change and the effect that that has on the land system and so on, plus the pressure we're putting on global society through biodiversity loss and the effect that that has on food production, or combined with disease threats and the effect of different pollutants and all these things together, we don't know about the ways in which they might all combine just to create pressures on global society in the form of could be starvation, could be immigration, could be just, could be leading to civil unrest. We just don't know how the whole kind of boiling pot of the wonderful, stable world that I've known all my lifetime might just, what it would take to put that under so much pressure that it really suddenly looks much less sort of peaceful and stable and nice as the one that I've always known. So that's why, that's why 1.5 isn't a hard line in the sand.
Okay, and then question about local government, local councils.
What should local councils do? Well, you could do, in some ways I'm not, the local councils that I work with mostly, I work a little bit with Cumbria County Council, and I work with all the national parks, which are kind of similar in some ways, but I don't get, I'm sure there are people on this call who get a lot more closely involved with that stuff than I do. But what I would say is, what seems to be a really good thing to try and model is a really inclusive, democratic process. And you could do a lot worse than setting up citizens' juries to make sure that you are covering off all the things that matter to the people in that council in a way that's properly respectful of all the perspectives that are going on in it, and to model this systemic thinking. Every area, whether it's a country or a little local area or whatever, almost all countries are just a very small part of the planet. And the thing to model is, what does it look like when we're making a proper systemic response to this that is simultaneously looking at the well-being of people and the well-being of the environment and the economy and jobs and energy and all these things and food production all in the round together.
One bit of that I think should give us all hope. At least I don't know if this is a coincidence. I think it isn't, but I work quite a lot across the Northwest, and I see some really good things happening where local authorities are a unitary authority. And actually, Blackpool has done some amazing work on sort of climate resilience and looking at retrofitting. Blackpool's got some of the sort of worst housing stock in the country, and looking at investing in sort of retrofitting insulation, both to sort of reduce emissions but also reduce heating bills. Blackburn with Darwin and other unitary have instigated citizens juries, including environmental citizens juries, which I think has been really, really interesting. And certainly when you get down into Greater Manchester with the combined authorities there's some really good, strong environmental leadership. So given that we're just in the process of obviously welcoming the new Westmoreland and Furness unitary, potentially there's some cause for hope there. Yeah, right. I'll give you some quick fire questions now, Mike, if I can.
Yep.
I'll ask you three together, kind of drawing together a few different questions, and I'll put them all to you together, and then you can decide the balance over the next few minutes, how you want to answer them. So the first one is around really around sea level rise. So obviously Morecambe Bay, very low lying area. We have between 2 and 5 millimeters a year of sea level rise, and in places there are sort of indications that some of the sea defences are starting to be breached. So whether maybe you can give a comment around the approach that Morecambe Bay should be taking to rising sea level. The second one is that 2024 is predicted to be one of the hottest years ever. And do you think that might trigger some kind of transformational change in how we see, our awareness of climate change, and whether actually seeing is believing, and that might make an impact? And then the third question is, if you could recommend one action that people should be taking, particularly young people around the Bay, whose future is going to be most affected by the issues you've talked about tonight, what would that one action be? So this is a quick fire round.
Okay. My one action for young people would probably be to do a very careful choice of your media information streams. Just ask yourself the most critically searching questions you possibly can about what your evidence is for trusting your sources of information. I hope that's an answer that young people can run with.
Yeah.
Even just asking the question and trying to answer it is a really good start point. Even just recognizing that it's a really important question. 2024 being hot. Well, there are different mechanisms by which we humans can wake up and get excited about something and respond to it. And one mechanism that some people hope for is that the time will come, there will be we'll get some symptoms that we don't like floods or a heat wave or something like that. And we'll suddenly go, crumbs, that's nasty. And then we wake up and we respond. And humans are quite good at that. We're quite good at that kind of reactionary response. The trouble with the situation we've got here in the Anthropocene is that the system doesn't work like that. What happens is if you wait for the symptoms and then you react to the symptoms, unfortunately, at the point at which you react to the symptoms, it takes a long time to make some changes and put the brakes on and turn things around and start make things better again. And the first thing that's going to happen, inevitably, is that after you have your shock moment, things are then going to get worse, considerably worse, for a considerable amount of time, whatever you do about it. So, whatever we do right now, the temperature is going to go up, a good chunk. And, if we have a heat wave in 2024, it's incredibly unlikely that there's anything we could do to make sure that that was the nastiest heat wave we ever had. So I worry about this waiting for the reaction, waiting till it hurts and then trying to jump out the bar approach to it. What we have to learn how to do, and in a way this is the kind of evolutionary challenge for humans. I mean, we have to, one way of looking at, just to talk about the evolutionary challenge, one way of looking at where humans are at now is we've developed all this science and technology. It's taken us into the Anthropocene. Now we have an evolutionary challenge to learn how to live in the Anthropocene. So we need to learn, for example, how to be nice to each other at the global level, cooperate with each other at the global level. We're pretty capable of being nice to each other on a small scale a lot of the time, but we're not anything like as good at being nice to each other at a big scale. But another way of looking at the evolutionary challenge, another element of it, is that we need to get much better at thinking further into the future and imagining what things might be like quite a long way out, decades out, not just a couple of years out, and caring about that and getting an emotional reaction to that, which is strong enough that we actually take proper preventative action. We're not anything like good enough at anticipating what might be around the corner, even especially when it's uncertain, and taking evasive action because of that. So, I worry about, sometimes I think I hear people kind of hoping that what we can rely on is that one day something nasty will happen that will be just nasty enough to wake us up, but not so nasty enough but not quite nasty enough to kill us all. And I wonder that mechanism will never be enough to keep us out of trouble.
Yeah.
And what should Morecambe Bay do about sea level rise? Well, I don't want to get too close into the specifics of it because I'm not, I haven't studied the specifics of Morecambe Bay in anything like the depth that I'm sure there are people on this call who've done. But I would just say about adaptation, which is that it's clear we'd be mad not to be adapting in the ways that we should for some of the changes that we know are coming our way. And I'm skeptical about Kendall's river flood defenses, because I think we'd have been far better off doing something much more nature-based, way up in the valleys and the hills to slow the waters down. But you can't really do that with the tide. But what do I think about adaptation in general is I think it's really important to bear in mind that when we start needing to spend money on adaptation, it's because we haven't got things right. It's because we've been slow off the mark and we've allowed a situation to get out of hand that should never have got out of hand in the first place. So if we start needing to adapt, it's a sign that we haven't been managing things well. And what we need to absolutely be incredibly clear about is there is no way that we can adapt our way out of this situation. So in some ways, I worry about adaptation because although, of course, it's the right thing for the people of Morecambe Bay to adapt to get themselves out of trouble, the idea that somehow it's okay because we're adapting out of it has to be absolutely nailed. If we just try and adapt our way out of trouble, things will escalate way, way, way out of control for us.
Mm. That's a really good, I think that's slightly different answer to sometimes what I hear. But what you're saying is that we do very much have to do everything we can to sort of stop the cause of the problem as well as just adapting to the effects. So I think that
has to be the primary.
Felt clear.
Yeah, the primary effort.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just before I say thank you, and just while we still got a large number of people on the call, I'm just going to give a couple of kind of local messages, Morecambe Bay Partnership messages. The first one is a reminder that on the 30th of July, we're doing a Cross Bay walk to raise money for Morecambe Bay Partnership. So a lot of you will have seen the Cross Bay walks, and usually they're raising money for charities where the walk is kind of slightly incidental, whereas this is the first time it's ever been done to raise money actually to help all the work the Morecambe Bay Partnership does looking after the bay and the communities around the bay. So if you haven't already booked on that and you want to take part, you can go onto the website, Morecambe Bay Partnership website, and there's full information there. So that's the 30th of July. And then the second bit of information, I've never actually said this before, but the very beginning, I said that I'm a volunteer with Morecambe Bay Partnership. I'm a trustee, and we are actually looking for new trustees. So Bill, who's one of our trustees, is here. So if getting a little bit more involved in the charity itself and the kind of the governance of the charity and sort of helping the resilience of us as an organization, if that's something that interests you and you think you've got skills that would help and you've got a passion for the bay, then keep an eye open. The the information isn't live yet, but on the 11th of May, the advert and basically the sort of information about how you could apply to be a trustee and more information about what it entails will be up on the website. So if you think that sounds like something you might want to do, then please keep an eye open on that, and we'll be having some drop-in evenings where you can come and talk to us a little bit about the role and about the wider work of Morecambe Bay Partnership. So Sarah's just put a link onto the volunteering get involved page, and the trustee information will be there if that sounds like you. And we'd obviously welcome applications from people of all sort of backgrounds, ages, interests. Basically, if you've got a love of the Bay and you live or work here, or you're from here, then we'd welcome information. That includes you, Mike. I have to say, you know, we're not fussy. If you love the Bay and you've got skills, we'll take you. So watch out for that. So we're well past 8:30, which is our normal cutoff. Still got 50 people here, and we have, you know, it's just so many people still here listening. So interested, and really thought-provoking, Mike. Brilliant topic, brilliant answers to the questions as well. So we'll give you a final round of applause, and we'll let everyone get back to their lives, hopefully with I don't know, a new spring in their step, and some new positive intention and respect as well. We loved your values that you shared, so it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. You're welcome anytime.